Thanks for tuning in for another episode of our series of CIRP's mental health webinars. Enjoy and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
Hi everyone, I'm Mardean. I'm the case manager here at Construction Industry Rehab Plan. I help get the clients oriented with the program, assigned to counselors, off to treatment if they need, and all the communication and planning that goes around that, and the successful transition back to work, and and any other community resources people are looking for, I can help them find. Vicky, for those of us out there who don't know about Construction Industry Rehab Plan, can you explain it for them?
Sure. Again, most of you will probably, well, we hope most of you know construction rehab. So we are a mental health and substance use program. We're offered to the unionised sector of the construction industry. So we offer mental health and substance use programs. We will offer prevention and promotion strategies for the industry. We also offer education and training for the industry as well. So basically anything to do with mental health and substance use, we're your guys. We also offer help for family members as well. So if you are a member yourself and you actually want help for your family member, so it might be a spouse, a child, a family member, and then we can help them as well.
Thanks, Vicky. Before we start, let us know what CIRP can do to support you as our members in the trades to maintain positive mental health by answering the poll questions below. Use the chat feature to send us your thoughts and comments, and use the Ask a Question button to ask a question. Vicky, we know that workplace bullying is an issue within the industries. Can you tell us more about this term and the psychology of it?
For sure. So bullying is, I think we all know bullying is a big problem in the workplace. Bullying is a problem in a big problem within the construction industry, but across all industries. It's something that happens, unfortunately, more often than we would want that to be going on. Bullying in and of itself, it's important to understand the construct of bullying. Bullying is when there is an imbalance of power between two or more people. So it requires a person to hold power, and it requires another person in that dynamic to have no power or little power. And so it's that imbalance of power, and it's that imbalance of power that's used for negative outcomes. So it's when we have many scenarios and there's many situations and times in our lives when we are in a position where we have less power than another person. That in and of itself doesn't make it bullying, but it's that negative consequence, it's that negative outcome that makes something bullying. It has a massive toll on employees. We know this. There's lots and lots of research that shows us that bullying can have a huge psychological impact on people, and it can also have a physical impact on people. We know that people that experience bullying are more likely to have higher rates of stress, higher rates of hypertension. There's a lot of evidence that points to higher rates of heart disease as well. So bullying is something that we need to take seriously. It's something that we can't just brush off as it's just somebody messing about, or it's just hazing, or it's just the culture of us just playing and messing and just teasing. And so it's something that we really do need to take seriously. Bullying is protected. Individuals are actually protected under legislation, not from bullying itself, but from harassment. There is a slight difference when we talk about bullying in the workplace. However, bullying is covered under employment law, because employers are required to protect employees from physical and mental harm. So you are covered, but it's covered under employment law. That's where it sits in terms of legislation. So in terms of bullying itself, we know that there's 4 types of bullying. We've got physical bullying, we've got verbal bullying, we have social bullying, and cyberbullying. Physical bullying is something I think that we probably all recognise. This is the very overt and very obvious type of bullying that happens. It's probably the most common type of bullying we see in schools, or we may have even experienced ourselves growing up, or in families even. And this is where there's physical altercation. So it could involve pushing or shoving, a destruction of somebody's property. And of course, you've got the more serious side of this when you've got sexual harassment and assault. These would all be considered forms of bullying. And it's when there is force or aggression is used over another person. That's when we would really call this physical bullying. And the interesting thing with physical bullying is it's more likely to occur at the workplace. And that's, it's less likely to occur outside of work. So when somebody is experiencing bullying at work, they're more likely to experience physical bullying. At least that's what the research tells us. The other type of bullying that occurs is verbal bullying and social bullying. So verbal bullying is that is when we use it's as it sounds. It's when you're getting attacked from another person through words. So people are using words that include racism or bigotry. You know, so they're using the words to intimidate you or to exert power over another person. Verbal bullying is often will turn into harassment, the legal definition of harassment. And the reason for that is because verbal bullying is often rooted very much in discrimination. So when someone's verbally bullying someone, they are usually identifying pieces or features of that person's life or about their person themselves. So it involves racism, bigotry, an intolerance for somebody's, say, for example, gender or sexual identity, whatever that might be. The thing with verbal bullying that I find perhaps the most problematic, especially as adults, and probably some of the things that we hear the most in the program when people are describing or our clients are talking to us about bullying is that it's often masked as a joke. So verbal bullying, so people will often, you know, kind of pretend they're joking, but what they're actually doing is very hurtful information, making hurtful comments, or they might be expressing bigotry to you, but it's masked as a joke. For me, that is actually the worst kind of bullying, because it's easy for folk to pass off. So if somebody was to raise this to their superiors, for example, and the person that you might identify, they might turn around and say, actually, I was joking, you know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, it was a joke, or you know, oh, sorry, it was a bad judgment on my part, or, you know, that person just can't take a joke. So it's a bit, it's the worst kind for me, because it's so easy to mask or to hide in jokes. And I think, to be honest with you, I'd love to hear from the audience. I'd love to know if this is something that you have experienced or witnessed even. And that is where people are actually really saying things that are quite unkind, but they're masking it as a joke. I know that one of the things I always say, and I know, Mardean, you probably had this conversation with your clients as well, is that a joke really does need to include 2 people in that. You know, you have to be, a joke has to involve 2 people who find the content funny, right? So, Mardean, you crack a joke. I also have to find that a joke, find that same content to be funny for it not to be offensive. And we hear that a lot on the program, and I'm sure you've heard that as well, right? I know Mardean takes is usually the first point of contact after Nicole when clients call in.
I have a question about that, Vicky. What happens when the person laughs and thinks it's a joke as well, and so the response doesn't look like they're hurt?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that happens, I would say, probably more often than not, because, you know, nobody wants to be that person that can't take a joke, right? So, and we become almost complicit in the process without even wanting to, because again, the whole dynamic is about power imbalance. So me, if I was talking to my peer and we were joking and there was equal power within that relationship, that joke is more likely to land. If there is an imbalance of power within that dynamic, then that joke is not going to land. But then the question becomes, as you said, how do I respond? So as I kind of talk about this further on, but I'm happy to talk about it now, one of the things that I always recommend is, if this is something that's happened to you, the first thing you've got to really do is identify for yourself, okay, is this funny, right? Do I find this funny? Did this person, was this a deliberate attempt to kind of put me down? And if you find that you feel quite icky, or you feel this sense of unease around what's being said, it's really important to tackle things early, super early. I was talking about this subject yesterday, and I was talking about the fact that what you find with bullying is, bullies don't come in 100 miles an hour, right? Bullies don't come in and go from 0 to 100. What they do is take an inch, right? You know that old expression, you give an inch, they take a mile, and that perfectly sums up bullying. So what happens is, people want to know if they actually do have power over you, and whether they are able to exert that. So they'll dip a toe in initially, and then if you respond, if it's masked as a joke, and the person that's on the other end of that, if they turn around and kind of join in with that, they kind of go, okay, I got away with that, and so now I'll inch forward another inch, right? And that's how it tends to start. So I'd say, if you are at the end of that, and importantly, it makes you feel bad, or you find, the other thing to kind of note is, if you find yourself leaving a conversation with another person, and you leave, and then you find that you are feeling bad about yourself, you're feeling a sense of shame has come over you, or any other negative emotion, then you might want to stop and check and go, okay, I don't know that this was as innocent as that person was trying to make out. And so you might want to go back and say, hey, this wasn't cool, this wasn't okay.
So what happens if the bully has a whole team of bullies?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that is when that type of bullying is actually something we call social bullying. So social bullying is very relational in nature, and what that means is it relies on separating an individual from his or her peers around them. So at school, it's where we typically see this at school when children are being excluded by other children, right? So the bully is actually working proactively, maybe not so much towards the person themselves, they may or may not be doing that to the person, but certainly around them. So they're separating the individual from his or her peers, and that's definitely identified as social bullying. And so what happens is, when they separate that person from your peers, and as an adult, that can happen in the workplace as well. And so that can come from, things like, hiding your tools, or getting other people in on the joke, and they might say, hey, why don't we take so-and-so's tools and hide them, and then everybody laughs as that person can't find the tools, for example. So that's social. And so the thing to do with that is, when that kind of bullying happens, understand how social bullying works. Social bullying only works and needs to work on separating you from your social peers. So that's when you really want to, not as much as you may feel like isolating, as much as you may feel this is really overwhelming and you can't deal with it, that's when you actually want to try and push forward. That's not always an easy task, I will say this. It's not always an easy task, and that's where a mental health professional can help. And sometimes you might even need to go to your superiors to kind of assist in that, and kind of see if they can help you with part of this. And what you're doing there is creating allies, and that's the other thing we talk about with social bullying. In this situation, what we want to do is have the person who's at the end of on the other side of the bullying to be able to go out and find allies and connect with other people. And it's when you can connect with other people, the social bullying can't actually take place, because it actually relies on separating you from your from your peers. And again, one of the things you can do is actually have other people, when they're allies, you want to talk to them and say, you know, this conversation that I had with X was quite, it wasn't okay. And so you want other people to be able to step up and call that bully out. If you have witnessed this, what I would say to anybody watching, if ever you have witnessed this, you yourself have not bullied somebody, but I will say that what that has done, when we haven't stepped in those situations, it's given more power to the bully. And so I would ask people that may have witnessed this kind of thing, as safely as you can, to maybe jump in and say something like, you know, hey, Bob, hey, Jane, John, and I apologise to all Bob, Janes and Johns out there. You might want to say, listen, that wasn't cool. Let's not. That's not how we act. That's not the way we behave here at this place. And so having that third person jump in can really help those kinds of situations. And what that does is break down the structure of social bullying. So the third person in that kind of situation is very, very important.
Vicky, can you explain what bystander apathy would be in this case?
Yes, that's a great question, Mardean. So bystander, in psychology, we call this the bystander effect. So there is this thing that occurs in group dynamics, and it's well researched and it's well established. And that is that when there is 3 or more, 4 or more, 5 or more people witnessing an event, you are less likely, even though your morals, your ethics, your ability, your capacity, even your past history may suggest that you would normally stand up to something that you see, or you would engage, whatever that. It doesn't necessarily mean bullying, but you know, if you saw some bullying, you would stand up and defend that person or jump in. This thing happens where when there are lots of people, a bystander effect happens where you kind of do not step in, despite the fact that ordinarily, if you was by yourself, you would do it. And this is a very powerful psychological effect. It happens again and again and again, where we tend to step back and go, okay, well, so-and-so is here, they will do it, they will jump in and stop what's going on, or they will come in and take care of what's happening. And that's a very powerful, even though you might think, if I asked you now, if I said to you guys, hey, and do you think you would jump in and help someone? And I hope, and I suspect a fair amount of people say absolutely, but we also know that that effect is so powerful that people actually don't jump in and stand up for somebody when that happens. That was a great question, Mardean. Fantastic. Again, I'd be really interested to hear from those of you that are watching today. Has this ever happened to you? Have you kind of been in that place where you've watched this and then you've afterwards thought, why didn't I say something? I wonder why, or whatever. Or even have you been on the receiving end of that kind of bullying? Be really, really interested to hear that.
I think there's always an expectation that somebody else has already done it, so you know, I don't have to.
Exactly. And sometimes that happens at an unconscious level. People aren't consciously thinking, oh, I won't deal with it. You know, Mardean can deal with it, so I'm not going to deal with it. I would normally, but I'm not going to. Mardean will do it. It's not something that happens at a very conscious level. It's an unconscious process that happens. But yeah, very, very strong process. So the other thing I wanted to touch on is the fact that, you know, one of the things I always say to employers is that you can't afford not to tackle bullying in your workplace. It has a huge financial impact on workplaces. There's a study shows that it's anywhere between $6 and $13 billion is the cost of workplace bullying. And we know that there's PTSD rates go up, rates of prescription medications go up, psychotropic medications go up hugely. We know that people that are struggling with bullying will often use antidepressants. They're using sleep medications. It just tends to those medications tend to go up with people when they're being bullied. Another interesting study, which I think is really something that might surprise people, and please do let me know if you kind of go, actually, no, it wasn't a surprise, and that is that research shows that when you, as an adult, when you are in the workplace, 70% of bullying comes from your boss. That might come as a huge surprise to people, that actually 70% of your bullying comes from a boss. But when you start to break that down, it actually makes a lot of sense. Remember, bullying in and of itself as a construct is an imbalance of power. It requires one person to have power and another person to not have power. And so when you have organizations where you have hierarchy, so you have your workers, you have your supervisors, you have your management, and then you have the executive level, you have this natural inbuilt hierarchy and a natural inbuilt levels of power. And so that bullying happens quite naturally. Now, I will say that when we talk about this kind of bullying, it's not always from an intentional place. Bullying can come from an unintentional place. It can happen when people it's not their intent to bully somebody, but because of that power imbalance, it can turn into bullying without even the person realizing that that's happened. One of the things you'll tend to hear is when I push people hard, it gets results, right? How many of us have heard that before, right? Or they don't understand the kind of stress I'm under. I don't have time to worry about people's soft feelings, right? And I'm sure we've all heard that somewhere along the lines, right?
So would that then be about productivity in the bottom line and without the boss even realizing it?
Yeah, absolutely. So recognizing, again, what this isn't saying is that this study wasn't saying that bosses are inherently nefarious in nature, that they're deliberately trying to bully people. My own position notwithstanding, of course, and I don't. No one's, yeah.
Vicky, if I could just jump in here, we've had a question. So going back to when you were talking about the bystander effect, and when you were talking about making sure that if you are the third party person that you do interject during any kind of bullying, we've had a question from the audience that asks, is talking to the people after as good as interjecting during the actual event of verbal bullying and harassment?
It's still effective, but not as effective. Because there's a lot of power that person is deriving from being, having this audience. They like the fact that there's an audience and they're choosing to have that audience, right? They're not pulling you aside to have this bullying conversation separately. They're actually doing it in that situation, which means that's where they're deriving that power. And remember, we must never forget, this is what bullying's about. Bullying is about this imbalance of power. One person has a lot of it and is not only has it, is exerting that power over another person. So I would say, yes, definitely pulling that person aside is always a good thing. But the effect is greater and it has more impact if you do it in the moment. But that's not an easy thing to do. It really isn't an easy thing to do. So what I would say is, if you have witnessed that, or you think that you might be in a position where you might witness that in the future, one of the things to do is to really utilize our understanding of psychology. I always say I live, eat and breathe psychology. So one of the things you want to do is, when you speak to somebody, use their name. Now, this might seem like a very, very little thing or a inconsequential thing, but it's actually a very powerful tool that actually we use in psychology. We use that. Our clinicians use that. I'm sure Mardean uses that all the time, because what happens is it actually has this effect of, whenever you use somebody's name, you bring them psychologically into their own sense of self. You really tie their behaviors to their name. And that's something that, again, is actually borne out in research. We know that effect happens. And so what you want to do is say something along the lines of, hey, John, again, I apologize to all Johns out there. Hey, John, I know you're a decent person. I know that you wouldn't intentionally do this, but come on, that's not cool. That's not okay. And there's that sentence, while it may seem just a sentence that you've used, there's actually a lot of psychological power in that sentence. One, we've used the name. Two, what we've actually said is, I know you're a decent person. That is very key when you're addressing bullies. Believe it or not, and I know this often, and I say this often to people, and people on the other end of it will sometimes say, yeah, no, people are just bad. But actually, people pretty much across the board will think of themselves as good people, even bullies, even people that are aggressive, even people like you name it. We know that generally people think of themselves as good people. It's just one of these things that happens as human beings. We generally think of ourselves as good people. Even though we may do bad behaviors from time to time, we think we're good. And so what you're doing is saying, hey, John, I know you're a decent person. So you are actually setting them up. You're saying, I know you're a decent person. By saying that, you create a situation where it's difficult for that person to argue against what's going to follow, because that would actually say, I'm not a decent person, right? So you're actually almost setting that person up to not argue with what's coming. So you want to say, hey, John, I know you're a decent person and you wouldn't intentionally do this. And then you have to name what the actual thing was that you witnessed. But come on, that's not cool. And that actually packs a huge psychological punch when you use the sentence constructed in that way. And of course, repeat it wherever necessary. Body language. So the other thing I would say is if you are going to be trying this kind of intervention, what you don't want to do, and I think a lot of people worry about the bully's attention being diverted from that person to themselves, and I'm sure that's something that people really do worry about. So but remember, bullies need to exert power. So you're pretty safe because you've actually exerted power by saying, hey, I know you're a decent person, but you wouldn't do this. You wouldn't intentionally do this, but that's not cool. So you've actually exerted some power. And so now the bully has to make a decision. He has to decide, or she has to decide, am I going to go toe-to-toe with this person, or am I going to exert some more power? And often they will back off. They might grumble. They might have a few choice words, a few colourful words, but they'll generally back off. And the other thing when you do that is to stand tall and proud, right? And we used to hear that as kids all the time. I know, my parents used to say, stop slouching, stand tall and proud. And the reason you do that is because, again, remember, bullies need to take an inch before they can take that mile. And they do that in a snapshot. They do that in an instant. They take a look and say, okay, who is vulnerable? Who is the person that I can exert this power over? So if you are coming in meek when you want to say that sentence, that's not going to be a good thing. You want to stand tall, stand proud. So you want to give this overall message that actually there is no lack of power here, and that can really it's quite powerful, actually, very powerful. So just
oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I just said those are some really great suggestions, and I think it's really important to consider using the person's name, like you said. I'm just concerned about our time here, so we are nearing the end of our time. Are there any last questions from the audience that you want to pose before we wrap up? All right, so if there's no more questions from the audience, then I would like to thank Vicky and Mardean for this presentation. I know there's a lot to talk about with bullying, so we might consider doing another session on bullying to maybe cover some of the things that we haven't covered today. So if that's something that interests anybody in the audience, please leave a comment. And other than that, I'm going to remind everyone to vote in the polls before we close. And if you want more information, there's a link on the bottom for our Facebook page where we can post more information and resources from our talk today. So thank you everyone for coming, and join us again. We're thinking maybe in 2 weeks for another conversation about mental health. Be safe and well.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
If you liked our video and you want to see more like it, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel.